Hi, welcome to Podcast 6. We're going to be talking about bureaucracy. This is Chapter 13 in your book. Our culture has a distaste for this word, bureaucracy. It mostly stems from our fear of big government, which we've had since the birth of the nation. But it's actually one of those things that if bureaucracy suddenly disappeared, our way of life would pretty much fall into chaos. The executive branch is tasked with enforcing laws and regulations and administering government services, and there really would be no way to do that without bureaucracy. So what is it? It's a complex mix of human beings and organizations with a lot of different agendas, but the simple way to think about it is that it's a kind of hierarchy that organizes people according to specific missions or functions, formal rules, and specialized knowledge. So this exists at all levels and branches of government. But when we talk about federal bureaucracy, we're talking about those organizations under the executive branch at the federal level. I hope you've gotten the idea by now that government and lawmaking is probably a lot more fluid than you previously thought. It's open to a lot of interpretation, even after a law is passed. So one of bureaucracy's main functions is to do exactly that, to interpret. They take often vague or even missing wording in laws and construct rules that make it easier to implement that law. A law, once it's passed, has to be implemented. There's no way to do that without some interpretation of the text. Without these rulemaking bodies, business wouldn't know what was required of it, say on financial filing or environmental fronts. Commerce would probably come to a screeching halt without these rules. Now, the rulemaking is not done in a vacuum. The bureaucratic institutions often work with Congress to craft rules that are acceptable to all or most of the constituencies. And there's another check, which is that new bureaucratic agencies have to be created by Congress. One exception is people who work in the executive office of the president, but most of the agencies have to be created by Congress. So there's been fairly new agencies in the last 10 years. The Department of Homeland Security, which had its impetus after 9/11 to be created, and the Department of Consumer Affairs. But those all had to be created by Congress itself. The president cannot create new agencies. Now, like the presidency, the bureaucracy has also expanded over time, especially as the economy became more complex and the government expanded its services, especially starting with the New Deal era, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Your book talks about 4 general types of organizations that have kind of evolved. They are departments, independent executive agencies, independent regulatory agencies, and government corporations. Departments have been around since the very early days of the country, but the other 3 types I mentioned really emerged in the 20th century in response to kind of the huge expansion and scope of power that the federal government began taking on in the last 100 years. The modern federal bureaucracy really comes from the progressive era, which is the late 19th and early 20th century, and it came in response to a lot of abuse by capitalist organizations, large monopolies, say in steel or transportation and banking, that had begun to dominate the U.S. economy and really were warping the U.S. economy, taking advantage of their huge market share. A good example is Standard Oil, to drive smaller competitors out of business. So we needed something to check business, and antitrust laws, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act, were passed to try to check that unfair advantage that some of these firms had, especially in price control. And we've had to enforce. We've used the Antitrust Act for many different occasions. Most recently, Microsoft was charged by the U.S. Department of Justice based on the Sherman Antitrust Act. And actually, we were successful in checking Microsoft from having its software, and to the exclusion of all others, in every single computer. So the history progressed. We got more safety, especially safety regulations. For example, today we take it for granted that anything we buy at the grocery store is untainted and has been checked for safety, but until the U.S. Department of Agriculture instituted inspections that made sure the food supply was safe, say if you were living in the 19th century, you could never be quite sure. And as I mentioned before, the 1930s and the New Deal era of Franklin D. Roosevelt created new agencies, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Works Progress Administration, many others, to provide work for people during the Depression. And so over time we kind of got used to the idea that government, could create new agencies to either boost the economy, regulate business, rein in business. And then, of course, in the 1960s, we had these large social programs to kind of provide what they often refer to as a safety net for the elderly or the poor. We have Medicare and Medicaid, which was established in that time. The Environmental Protection Agency, which actually was established by President Nixon, a Republican president. And we have that at the state level as well, are there for protection. But of course, these agencies impose what economists often call externalities. It's kind of a long word just to describe the costs imposed on society by the actions of these bureaucratic organizations. And so, the balance here is keeping those externalities from hurting business and stopping stopping economic growth, while still making sure that safety regulations are in place that protect the public good. So bureaucracy lies at the center of this major ideological split I've talked about before, which is the debate over how big government should be. So if you consider yourself a conservative, an ever-expanding bureaucracy is not something we want. The argument would be it leads to increased restrictions on the economy and it hurts businesses with these costly regulations. Like I said, on the other hand, we don't want to dismantle institutions that do things like keep our food safe or regulate drugs that are safe to be put on the market. So I would just caution you, don't fall into this easy trap of extremism when you talk about it, which says that any new government agency is bad, or on the other side, any new government agency is doing a great job. It's really not either one. We can assume there are huge inherent inefficiencies in government that can be rooted out, but not every agency that's created is bad either. So try to keep yourself balanced in the middle as you're studying this. So pay attention also in your book to the description of iron triangles and issue networks. And you have a video on this, so I'm not going to go into detail on this, but it's important to understand that from these official hierarchical structures that I've been talking about, you get these informal structures born from those same agencies. And an iron triangle, for example, is really just a collaboration between interest groups, congressional committees, and executive agencies. That's the three corners of the triangle. Check out figure 13.5 in the book, and you'll see how these agencies kind of feed into each other and create an equilibrium. Issue networks are really just less organized structures of interest groups, and you should not underestimate how immense the interest group structure is, especially in Washington, but they're nationwide. These interest groups make up very large issue networks that might be advocating one position or another within bureaucracy. So say one is in a pro-environment, but there's also, they want increased regulation on business and pollutants, but there'll be another issue network advocating exactly the opposite. So take a look at those in your book, and definitely watch that video to get a good understanding of those. Okay, a few things to ponder at the end here. First of all, now that you know something about bureaucracy, how is it possible for the average citizen to actually understand what this bureaucracy is doing? How can we get transparent information and then have an influence on what's going on? I think the scary answer to all of that may be that it's impossible. Even with the internet, if you go online and attempt to find out what's going on in these congressional committees and subcommittees and bureaucratic institutions, if you dig long enough, you can find a lot of things that were never available before. But I will say, the average citizen probably does not have the kind of knowledge that could get you there. So maybe there's a better way to translate to citizens what this huge structure is doing. Secondly, what kind of reforms do you think might make bureaucracy work better? Some, for instance, advocate privatization of a lot of public sector bureaucracies. Maybe you outsource the work to private companies that can do a service more cheaply or efficiently. President Bush, for instance, floated the idea of privatizing Social Security, which itself is a large bureaucracy. That was in 2006. But it was so unpopular that he dropped it pretty quickly. But could another privatization scheme work? That's an open question. Normally, it would be the Republican Party that's advocating that kind of position, so we haven't had a Republican president, but the next one certainly might offer some bureaucracy reforms along those lines. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.